Good day, everyone who's joined us. I'm Rick Salmons, Special Advisor to the UN Economist Network and Senior Fellow here at the Geneva Graduate Institute for International and Development Studies. Very pleased to welcome you today to this latest in our series of global book or major work webinars on the future of economics, and particularly the theory and practice of economic development. And this is a series that is organized by the UN Economist Network in association with about 10 or so academic networks from around the world who have an interest in improving fundamentally the pedagogy and practice of development. Today, we're privileged to have our co-convener of this series, Professor James Galbraith, who is the Lloyd M. Benson Junior Chair in Government and Business Relations and Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin, to moderate the session. And so with that, let me turn it over to you, James, to get us underway.
Thanks very much, Rick, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here. I want to welcome you, welcome everybody to this session. We are very fortunate today to have as our principal speaker Professor Ha-Joon Chang, SOAS Research Professor of Economics and a true stalwart of the theory and practice of development economics, whose most recent book in 2022 is called Edible Economics and is a study of the food system. He will speak for about 25 minutes and be followed by two discussants. They are Professor Irene van Staveren of Erasmus University, Rotterdam, Professor of Pluralist Development Economics. And Pluralist Development Economics, as we know, is the best kind, in fact, the only really plausible kind. So I want to welcome Professor van Staveren. And the second discussant will be Dr. Pedro Conceicao, the director of the United Nations Human Development Report Office, a physicist originally by training, as I happen to know, because he was a very long time ago a PhD student, only very loosely under my supervision at the University of Texas at Austin. So I want to welcome Pedro, especially to this session and to this network, where we hope to give exposure and have a chance to interact with some of the most vibrant and interesting and important thinkers in the development economics space now working. So with that, I'm once again delighted to have a premier example of the breed here, and I will yield the floor to my very long-term friend and distinguished colleague, Professor Ha-Joon Chang. All yours.
Okay, so today's talk of mine is titled, Why Do We Need Pluralism in Economics? Now, of course, the starting point is, as I kind of explained in this earlier book from 2014, there are at least 9 main schools of economics and several smaller schools, newer schools. So if you if you divide up some of the bigger schools into sub-schools, you could easily have about 20 different schools of economics or 20 different ways of doing economics. I try to avoid the term, but I would rather use mainstream, non-mainstream, or specify the school that is neoclassical and so on. And yeah, all these different schools are completely different in the sense that they have different views on what are the constituent parts of the economy. Is it individual, classes, institutions, and then they have different assumptions about the nature of individuals, their motivations, their rationality, the way that they have different views on how the economy changes and so on. So basically, these are different ways of doing economics that are unlike what some mainstream economists argue. They are just the kind of historical relics. Yeah? And because they are so different, they have different strengths and weaknesses, and none can claim overall superiority. So that's the most obvious justification for pluralism. Now, the mainstream neoclassical economists argue that neoclassical school is dominant because it has won the scientific debate. But my first point of departure is that debates in economics cannot be settled like the ones in natural sciences. Human beings have free will, ethical values, even imagination. Subatomic particles do not say, oh, everyone's moving in this way, but I think it's morally wrong to do that. Or the chemical substances that do not say that, oh, wouldn't it be better if we all defy the accepted route and moved in this direction in a coordinated way? I mean, it's just a totally different kind of subject matter we are talking about. And we cannot conduct experiments in economics in the way we can in physics or chemistry. And many of these the experiments have caused so much damage. And therefore, you cannot experiment with economic policies except in very, very minor, marginal way, like, our cities involving, I don't know, free subsidies, free fertilizers and so on. But even that, I think, has a serious ethical problem, because who are you, a graduate student in, I don't know, the North American university, European university, playing God with peasants in Mozambique, But even the ignoring the ethical dimension, the relevance of RCTs are very limited. And then most importantly, the practice of economics is intricately linked with money and power. So a particular economic theory can become dominant for reasons other than its intellectual merits. I mean, how these the tech billionaires, the hedge fund managers, they are funding particular types of economists, particular types of the think tanks, and so on. So there you go. I mean, we have to start from the observation that economics is not like natural science. I can think of a few justifications for pluralism, but the first one is, well, it's already implied. The world is complex and has many layers, but each theory focuses on certain levels and certain aspects, so they can help us understand only some part of the reality. And reality is really something that you have to take seriously. I mean, in talking about this, I often talk about the Singapore problem, or life is stranger than fiction. For example, when you hear about Singapore in the standard economic textbooks, in the financial press, you will only hear about its free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards foreign investors. But you will never hear that 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government. 85% of the housing is provided through the government housing corporation. And over 20% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises, including the famous Singapore Airlines. So I often challenge my graduate students give me one economic theory. It doesn't matter what it is, the neoclassical, Marxist, institutionalist. Give me one economic theory that can single-handedly explain Singapore. I dare say that there's no such theory. So the complexity of the world is that one important justification for pluralism. And then one could argue that, and this extend the first proposition in a temporal way, and argue that even if one theory can be considered the best at one point of time, another may become better in the future. So this is the genetic diversity argument in biology. I wouldn't go into further detail. But also, I would argue that we don't just need different theories and different people doing different things in silos, but I genuinely believe that we can benefit from more active interactions between different schools, which of course only can start when all schools agree that the others have many merits that they don't have. So ideas need to be cross-fertilized, and some obvious the possibilities of cross-fertilization have already been made. I once again am not going to go into the details, but cross-fertilization can be made between schools that we think, and more importantly, most of the members of the school think are incompatible with each other. Yeah? Despite their massive political differences, the classicals, the Keynesians, and the Marxists share a class-based view of the economy. Yeah? I mean, if you read the classical economics, I mean, of course, there's lip service to individual choices and so on at the kind of the marketing level, if you like. But the fundamental theory is about the division of surplus between different classes. Yeah? Classical economics is not an individualist economic theory. Yeah? And yeah, as a result, that you have post-Keynesians who basically fuse some of these ideas of classical and the Marxist schools into Keynesian theory. Yeah? The Austrians may regard the Marxists as mortal enemies, but their views on the role of technological innovation and its role in market competition are more similar to that of the Marxists than to the neoclassical ones. Yeah? Actually, Friedrich Hayek in the late 40s published a series of articles in American Economic Review, which was totally kind of disparaging about the neoclassical theory of perfect competition, and he advanced his own theory of competition, which is similar to that of Marx and Schumpeter than the neoclassical one. Yeah? And so on. So I'm, but once again, not going to give you all the details. We can make a very robust case for pluralism in economics, but then, of course, do the mainstream economists that listen to it hardly. Yeah? So the responses have been, at the basis level. I mean, these the many mainstream economists that have argued that these students advocating pluralism are taking an anything goes approach, and therefore opening doors for cranks. Yeah. So my former colleague in Cambridge, the Swedish economist Pontus Rendel, in an interview with the Financial Times, said that this pluralism is basically the supporting creationism in biology. Yeah? And he argues that the mainstream economics has immutable laws, and therefore it will be wrong to teach heterodox theories. And he's basically saying, I mean, and then he's not a particularly unique the person. I mean, he shares this view with many other mainstream economists that anything other than neoclassical economics is basically charlatanism, yeah, or superstition, or one of those things, yeah. Another a bit more reasonable response has been that, oh yeah, it'll be great if students can learn all the other stuff, but unfortunately they don't even have enough time to learn micro, macro, and econometrics, so we cannot teach them those other stuff. Yeah, I mean, this has been a very typical response. But when you look at economics curriculums in major kind of European universities and many universities in the developing countries, basically the students are learning the same micro, macro, and econometrics with increasing mathematical difficulties. And there's no real the additional intellectual contents to what they are learning. Yeah? So by the time they reach the PhD program, they might have gone over the same material like 4 times, except that every time the math, became more difficult. Yeah. So there is that space for teaching other stuff. Yeah, it's only because they think what they are already teaching is so important that nothing can be taken out of the current curriculum that they are making this argument. Yeah? And another typical response is, okay, these other schools, they are really very poor, but insofar as there are some worthwhile ideas in these the non-neoclassical schools of economics, they can be incorporated into the neoclassical framework, and they most of them have been. Yeah. So Philip Aghion picking couple of stuff from Schumpeter and turning it into math. Yeah. I mean that's the most typical example. Yeah. And some the microeconomists picking the idea of boundary rationality from the behavioralist school of Herbert Simon and turning it into some kind of optimization model, which entirely beats the purpose, because Simon's point was that you cannot optimize. You know? You just are not smart enough to optimize. You know? Or the world is too complex for you to optimize. You know? Whatever, however you may put it. You know? And then they say that, okay, maybe that your criticism was had the point until the, say, the 1990s, but now economists talk about all these other things that other schools have talked about, you know, history, institution, politics, and what have you, you know, the awarding of Nobel Prize to Acemoglu and company is a good the evidence that economists are taking all these other things seriously. So yes, the call for pluralism might have had a stronger case until the 80s and 90s when the many models ignore these things, but now that they are not, there's no ground for criticism. Yeah. Okay, I'm not even going to respond to the response number one, which is that anything other than neoclassical economics is the crackpot the theory. I mean, it's so ignorant. I don't know where to begin, but you know that we can engage with the response number two a bit more seriously. I've just already said it. But number three is the most the important comeback, yeah, because now they are saying, well, neoclassical economics actually has incorporated whatever little merit that was in other theories, and now we don't need other theories. Yeah. They also talk about the empirical turn in economics. Yeah. The medals and prizes that are being awarded to people doing RCT, the people that are running regressions that based on some historical data from Peru. And so they say actually that your criticisms are not valid anymore. Yeah? But my problem with this response is that the rediscovery of history, institutions, politics, and so on have been made as an attempt to protect the core tenets of neoclassical economics rather than as a result of genuine scholastic reawakening. Because when you think about it, when people have rediscovered all these other things, they didn't say, people here meaning mainstream economists, they didn't say, we are completely wrong to ignore these things. We apologize. We'll start again. Yeah. They wrote as if, oh yeah, here's another regression. Here's another RCT. As if they have been doing it all along. Yeah. So that's very dishonest. Yeah. And at the fundamental level, I would say that this kind of the approach is what I call the powdered egg problem. Yeah. Okay, so this is a bit of a weird thing. I mean, someone invented this technology to turn egg into powder in the 1920s. Yeah. Initially, no one took it seriously, but during the Second World War, this was a very, very important technology because at the time, Britain and the Soviet Union had to be supplied with food and arms and everything to fight the Nazis off by the US and Australia and so on. And how do you transport eggs? Yeah? I mean, it breaks, it goes bad quickly, it takes up the space. So the people realize that powdered egg is a great solution. Yeah? So a lot of people had to subsist on the powdered egg in Britain and the Soviet Union during the Second World War. But is this real egg? Yeah? Funnily enough, thanks to the American survivalists, this product is still bought and sold. Yeah. So these people who stock up their basement with water and cans and specialist rations and so on buy this stuff, and there's a clutch of reviews about this product. And as far as I can figure out, it is perfectly okay if you want to make scrambled eggs with it. For baking, there seems to be a debate. Yeah, some people think it's okay, some people think it's not. Yeah, but whatever you think about these other aspects, you know that you definitely cannot make a poached egg or egg fried sunny side up. Yeah, it cannot do everything that a real egg does. Yeah, so this new neoclassical theory that empirical theories like that. The core neoclassical theory has been built with the assumption that people have no history, they have no culture, maybe other than that of rational self-seeking, they are not affected by institutions in the society, and they are apolitical or political in a very unidimensional sense that they will vote for a politician who will transfer the largest amount of resources to them. And then you put back these things into your model, but the resulting theoretical constructs are not the same as theories that have been constructed with all those things intact from the beginning. Yeah? So in this, the powdered egg version of the neoclassical theory, there are institutions, but they are products of individual choices and have no role in constituting the individuals. There is politics, but it is another form of material exchange rather than a practice that involves ideology, ethics, and even emotion. Yeah? History is brought in, but often to show that throughout the ages, individuals have always been rational maximizers. Yeah? So this is, if you like, the free economics approach. Yeah? Everyone is a rational maximizer. Stupid looking Japanese sumo wrestlers, they are very crafty maximizers. Yeah, the Chicago drug dealers, they tend to be out of whack, but they are actually very rationally behaving and so on. In the same way, you bring back history, but only to show that whether it was the weekend market in the medieval Germany or farming system in the pre-Columbian Peru, people were rational, people were maximizing. So actually, funnily enough, the conclusion is that history doesn't really matter. Yeah? So yeah, I think that this the recent approach, which claims to have kind of invalidated many of the kind of justifications for pluralism and criticisms therefore of neoclassical economics has the fundamental methodological problem, which basically means that this one is only good for kind of saving neoclassical economics against the complex realities rather than providing a genuine solution. Okay, let me stop there. I've spoken a bit too long, but I hope I have made the main points. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ha-Joon. And let me turn over the floor to Professor von Staveren. The floor is yours for 10 minutes, or as we used to say when I was on the congressional staff, for such time as you may consume.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot, Ha-Joon, for a wonderful presentation. I read the whole interview in the Erasmus Journal of Philosophy of Economics, and I enjoy all your books. I have them either in English or in Dutch. And my husband is a professional photographer, and this image of you of kicking away the ladder, I wanted to use in my own textbook and MOOC. So although I have terrible fear of heights, I climbed up the shed with a ladder and kicked it at the right moment when he clicked the button of his camera.
Yeah, I saw that famous picture. Yeah.
Thanks for the inspiration. Yes, as was mentioned, my chair is even called Pluralist Economics, Pluralist Development Economics. And indeed, from the moment I entered the economics program as a student in Rotterdam in my bachelor, I already figured out in a couple of months' time, probably like you and many others, that what is this a strange discipline? With all these very limited assumptions about behavior, about prices, having all information and so on. And when I dared to ask questions, indeed, the responses were in a way that you refer to now to the discipline as a whole, like there's no time for it, or wait, be patient, it will come later in your studies. And obviously it never came. And when I worked for a while in the Dutch Development Cooperation, I was asked to include more gender into economics. But then there were some economists resisting this with the argument that you also mentioned, and it was phrased as, oh, it's another bowl on the Christmas tree. You know, the Christmas tree is already too full. We don't have space for another bowl on the Christmas tree. So I recognize a lot in what you say. On the first, I think it was your first slide, where you listed several schools of thought. You know that I'm also a feminist economist. I'm in various schools. I was a little bit disappointed that you listed feminist economics among the smaller schools. And I know you don't mean it to be minor or less relevant.
No, what I mean is numerical, smallness. Yeah.
Yes. But what we often, as feminist economists, how we picture feminist economics is more as cross-cutting.
Yeah.
Because there are neoclassical feminist economists, there are Marxist feminist economists, there are Keynesian and so on. So, well, that may be a suggestion for your 30-second presentation on the topic. And your last point on mainstream responses to critique, when the mainstream says, oh, but we do include some concepts from other schools. I fully agree. But I also think we should perhaps a little bit critical as the community representing a wide variety of schools, because I sometimes see other institutional or feminist or post-Keynesian scholars who somehow then use neoclassical language to frame their analysis, and then suddenly come up utility functions in a Marxist analysis. I see the strategic reason. So then hopefully, hey, you are being read. by mainstream economists. On the other hand, I'm afraid that it kind of undermines the validity of heterodox economics. So, for example, in feminist economics, we call this approach add women and stir. But yeah, you see it in some Marxist economists who then jump to the utilitarian framework and so on. So I think it would be good to be a bit self-critical on us as well, what strategies to look for, which is not easy, of course, because making economics more pluralist is a huge challenge. And I think you've done a great job in your popular work, so that at least also the general public realizes that there are more flavors of economics than the standard one that they perceive through the media, policy speeches by ministers of finance or central bank presidents and so on. So we each try to make an effort, I think, to broaden up economics. And sometimes there's a little window of opportunity, as right after the financial crisis, when the British magazine, The Economist, showed on its cover, I have it pinned down my wall here next to me in my office, a melting modern economics textbook. Right? That was, indeed, they recognized there was perhaps a moment that we should, as a discipline as a whole, reflect on what are we teaching. Nobody saw it coming, except indeed a couple of non-mainstream economists. We did see it coming. Of course, we could never point at the exact date, but that's not the point. But this window also closed quite quickly, unfortunately. I'm, for example, member of the Dutch think tank, the Sustainable Finance Lab, which was set up a couple of years after the crisis. The Netherlands is quite curious or special in the sense that we have a huge waterhead banking sector. The balance sheets of the three biggest banks is 3 times Dutch GDP. So no wonder that there were bailouts of Dutch banks. But in that think tank, we also felt that in the first few years, we had more policy space. There were parliamentarians listening to us. There were indeed a law passed, for example, a bonus cap of only 20%, whereas in the rest of the European Monetary Union, the bonus cap was 100%. But a few weeks ago, our new government and the majority of parliament agreed to move back some special positions in banks. But yeah, there you have it. And there are more examples. So yeah, looking back, didn't we use that opportunity well enough, perhaps? There is also, in terms of self-reflection, sometimes some dividedness between us, that kind of little fights between the post-Keynesians and the old institutionals, also even within post-Keynesian economics and within feminist economics. I don't think that is very helpful, although it is understandable. And in a way, in an ideal world, this is perfectly, but yeah, since we have a kind of common enemy, it may not be that useful. So can we learn from that? How we reacted, how we operated in this short window of opportunity to do it better, either next time when there is a crisis or after some other trigger moment. What we also see in some countries that there is a bit less demand for economics. Students who just graduate from high school, they prefer either to go to business schools or which is more hands-on, real-world oriented, rather than all these mathematical theoretical models. And there's more interest in more interdisciplinary programs with economics and politics and philosophy. So perhaps that is the new window of opportunity for us. Yeah, these are some questions I would like to raise with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I will turn the floor over to Dr. Pedro Felipe Teixeira da Conceicao, a very old and very dear friend. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jamie. It's been a while since I heard my full name.
I still remember it.
Not many people know it. So Jamie, at the beginning when he introduced me, started by making a reference to two things that I will use in my comments. And like Irene, I will draw not only what you presented, Ha-Joon, but also on the interview that you did that is very rich and has obviously much more than what you're able to present. So my first anecdote is when I was studying economics under Jamie, I asked him, there was something in our PhD program when we were taking courses that was called an independent study. I don't know if you remember this, Jamie. And I went to Jamie and asked, well, can I do something looking at the time, this was in the mid-1990s, and the endogenous growth theory were in fashion. So I wanted to understand this stuff, and I asked, can I do an independent study on this? And Jamie went ballistic and said, what? You want to study these guys? So finally he relented, as long as I also studied Pazinet and looked at the Cambridge controversies on the nature of capital, and it was a fascinating intellectual journey for me. But I'm mentioning this story as, in a sense, a declaration of interest that I'm also a pluralist, right? But I'm a pluralist that perhaps goes in the other direction. So I was interested in understanding and getting a grasp on neoclassical economics. And I guess this would be my first point. I mean, if we are really truly pluralists, my proposition would be that we should not necessarily be hostile to neoclassical economics as such. We should look at neoclassical economics as part of a toolkit that might be helpful in some instances. I would not look at neoclassical economics or the assumptions of consumer theory in standard consumer choice, in typical macroeconomics as necessarily the enemy. And to elaborate a little bit on what I mean by this, I will revert to the second point that Jamie mentioned about me, which was my training as a physicist. And here I would perhaps differ from you a little bit, Ha-Joon, in that it's true that the subject of physics and the subject of economics are inherently different, right? Because one is the physical world, the other one is about understanding people and how they interact. But the people doing the analysis are still humans, so they have to make choices. And I'm reminded of this.
Are you sure that's true, Pedro? I'm just okay.
Well, sometimes one doubts it. Now with AI, it's no longer that certain. But you get my point, right?
Yeah.
So the person doing the analysis also has to make choices. And in your interview, you mentioned some dialogues you had with your brother.
Yeah.
That actually looks at this, right? And I was reminded of a wonderful paper by Amartya Sen called Description as Choice, in which he challenges this idea that there is some pure truth out there that we can look at and describe in a neutral way, because any act of description implies making choices about what you focus on, what kind of models you use. And so in physics, it's no different, right? So when you listen to Richard Feynman's famous lectures on physics, he starts his first lecture by asking the question that, if there was a collapse and the world would disappear and we would need to provide to the next generation of creatures the most amount of information in the least number of words, what would that be? And he said, atoms in motion. So the atomic theory of matter. Now, this is a wrong theory, right? We know that it is wrong. It doesn't explain the world in any way, but it's useful. It's useful for many purposes. And I can give other examples. So, for instance, in physics, we know that Newtonian mechanics is wrong. Einstein proved both with special relativity and general relativity that is not the right way of describing the world. But we use it all the time. It's extremely useful. If I want to go to an appointment, I don't need Einstein's theory. Newtonian mechanics is good enough. But if I use a GPS on my phone, I better be sure that the GPS is adjusting for both general and restricted relativity, right? Because satellites are far away and they move very rapidly, so you have to do that adjustment. So I think my point is that a criterion, this is also for the network that is listening to us, what I would suggest, and I would like to hear your reactions and Irene's as well, is that we need to, in a sense, find the kind of paradigm and model that is useful for the problem you're interested in solving, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so is it a problem that the assumption, the behavioral assumption of neoclassical economics is the idea that people look after their own interest and assume that everybody else is doing the same? I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption of behavior. It's a reasonable assumption that is useful to describe many economic phenomena, many economic things, particularly market transactions. And it does explain many things, and it's useful for many things. The problem, in my view, and I think that you went to this in your interview and in your presentation, is extrapolating this and assuming that you can explain everything on the basis of this behavior.
Exactly.
And so, again, I'm a pluralist, but also sort of omnivorous, right? In the sense that I think we need to be using neoclassical models when they are useful and when they make sense. And we know they fail. So, for instance, when you try to use these assumptions, behavioral assumptions, to explain things like why do people oppose immigration? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And here I want to challenge a little bit, because in your interview you said, if only people understood economics and understood that it's actually costly for them to oppose immigration, I'm not sure if that would make a difference. Because in a sense, I think that your behavioral model is that people incorporate information, and if they understand it, they react to it in a sort of rational way. But, as you say, people have many different motivations. People react to things in ways that are driven by many other factors. And so one of the things that I think it's important for us to do, particularly in development economics, and we've been trying to do that in our human development reports recently, is to have this more sophisticated or complex understanding of human motivations and human behavior, the role of beliefs, the way in which they interact with preferences and emotions, the importance of the cultural context, history, as you said, Ha-Joon, is extremely important, particularly when it comes to development, where interventions that may be effective in a context will fail in another. So, and to do that, I think that rather than looking only at different schools of economics, we actually, and I believe you don't disagree with this, we need to look at other disciplines as well. Other disciplines in the social sciences and even the humanities. So one of the things I've been trying to do in our reports is to bring insights from history, which I received a huge pushback to have historians contribute to the human development reports. But I think it's crucial for us to be effective in, particularly in development, in the world of development economics.
Mm-hmm.
The final observation, and I would stop, Jamie, is I think a big blind spot, and I didn't hear you speak about it, both in your intervention and your interview, is the way in which we deal with the natural world and with the challenges that we're confronting in a context in which we are facing this dangerous planetary change, climate change and biodiversity loss. So I think that this calls for a deeper dialogue and engagement with ecologists and other people in the natural sciences. And I would be curious to have your view on how do you see this reflected in economics.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'll stop here, Jamie. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and this really gets us off to a very vigorous beginning. I'm going to take a second as the moderator to just offer an observation or two of my own here. While I am thoroughly in the pluralist camp, it does seem to me that there is a need for an overarching framework within which pluralist ideas can thrive. And it does seem to me that the neoclassical framework is largely going to be outside of such an overarching framework. And this is the core idea behind a little book that my co-author Jing Chen and I produced last year called Entropy Economics. The basic idea being that the most fundamental law of nature to bring economics in conjunction with nature is the second law of thermodynamics. And it is not present in neoclassical economics, which has its origins in an older tradition, a tradition which was predominant in thought through to the end of the 18th century, but began to fade out in the 19th. And this is where the rubber meets the road, it seems to me, because the pluralist traditions can all be made compatible. They're all about history and uncertainty and structure. And they're about the fact that living systems are entirely always regulated somehow. They're not freely self-organizing. And and it's not a question of whether their mathematics is in the system or not. You can place some very straightforward mathematics to describe the operation of a physical or social or an economic system, but it is not going to be a kind of abstruse algebra that always leads toward an equilibrium solution. The world is not an equilibrium system, and the notion that things drift toward a long-term equilibrium and therefore everything that disturbs it is a shock places all problems outside of the sphere of economics, and that's a fundamental problem. And we see it all the time. Every time something comes along, it's something no one could have foreseen, because all the people who did foresee it have been driven to the margins of the discipline where they can't be heard. So that would be the thought I would offer here, is that one ought to reach for a unifying common framework within which all the pluralist traditions can live, but which it ought to accept that there are some traditions that are going to find that deeply unsettling, because they really won't be able to adjust. I'll offer one other thought, Ha-Joon, since you mentioned Singapore, which is that Henry George would have been very comfortable in Singapore.
That's right.
Henry George would have, with a public ownership of land and the collection of land rent by the public authority, would have seen no difficulty. And in fact, there were American cities from San Francisco, Toledo, Buffalo, Chicago, Milwaukee, that operated on that principle for quite a long period of time, until the neoclassical economists came in and undermined it. So there's I suggest the Singapore puzzle is just another example of how one should have an open mind to some of the voices which have been driven to the margins of the discipline.
Excellent. Thank you. So, Rick, Jamie, do you want me to now respond to this?
Yes,
comment?
go ahead.
No, I mean,
I'm
so grateful to all three of you for your excellent comments. I cannot possibly deal with all of them with the same respect that they deserve. Let me pick a few things. I mean, Irene, it's true that, non-neoclassical economies also have stolen the neoclassical ideas. I mean, the so-called analytical Marxism comes to mind. John Romer, John Elster, I mean, they basically translated Marxist economics into neoclassical language. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with the translation itself, but lots of things get lost in translation, and you have to recognize that, and also that calling neoclassical Marxism analytical Marxism, that was very, very kind of dishonest, because it then gives the implication that only neoclassical economics is analytical, or only mathematical economics is analytical. So I think that I'm very happy to accept that there are problems on all sides. But as for your question on whether, I mean, to borrow from Mirovsky's expression, I mean, that this crisis has been wasted, I think the fundamental problem was in politics. I mean, internal fighting among neoclassical economists and so on, they matter too. But unless and this is why I have been trying to persuade the general public to learn economics, unless there's demand from the real world, in the ballot boxes or potential employers saying that these economics the graduates are useless, unless there's pressure from the real world, that economics I think it has passed the point where it can reform itself from within. I mean, we know many reasons, but there's a hugely kind of concentrated in network profession. I mean, the recent graduate student of mine who was doing his PhD actually in the Department of Philosophy of Science in Cambridge, he collated this data to show that 2/3 of the editors of the top 4 journals, AER, QJ, JP, Econometrica, they got their PhD from 4 departments, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Chicago, I don't think there's any other profession where it's that so concentrated in network, So that's the profession itself is beyond repair in the sense. I mean, the pressure has to come from the outside, Okay, Pedro's the comment on neoclassical economics. Yeah, no, I don't reject neoclassical economics. I mean, it can give you very useful analytical tools that is good at certain things, like all other schools, that for example, it was designed to analyze market exchange. So it's good at analyzing market exchange, but it really has nothing to say about production. I mean, there's a so-called theory of production in which some abstract quanta called capital is combined with some abstract quanta called labor according to some formula called technology, and something comes out. I mean, there's no understanding of how difficult it is to run the production process because there's a class struggle, there's kind of organization problems. There's no the discussion about how the process needs to be managed, not just technologically, but in terms of human relations and so. I mean, this is probably why, despite its the fundamental shallowness, what they teach in the business school is more appealing to the employers, because at least these people know that there are lots of other things that are required there. So yes, I mean, we basically have to choose the right framework, right theory for the right questions. So if you are trying to understand economic development, which fundamentally requires productive transformation, then you need to go to other theories than neoclassical economics because it's very weak there. But if you want to, understand how to regulate the utilities, how to manage the kind of the social welfare system and so on, I think neoclassical economics can be extremely useful. Now, I take your point on the physics not being this ideal thing that I gave the impression of it being. I totally agree that whatever it is, whatever the theory is, it's done by human beings, and therefore it's affected by that. But still, I think that the objects of inquiry, they are inanimate. They don't have free will. They don't have imagination. So there's some difference. But yeah, I mean, my brother being an eminent philosopher of science, I've been told that your idea of the science is 19th century. So I totally take your point. But as you say, I mean, there's this expression in Britain, which my old teacher, Jeff Harcourt, used to love, horses for courses. So different horses are good at running different courses. So that we need to learn about these things. Yeah, and yeah, your comment that my kind of plea for ordinary people to learn more economics is implicitly assuming that if they have the right ideas, they would act in the right way. I'm not sure I actually would said anything that would go that far, but yeah, I mean, what I wanted kind of ordinary citizens to know about is the existence of different economic theories, because that when whatever their political color is, when government wants to do something, they wheel out these experts, whether they are right wing or left wing or whatever. They'll say this is the scientific truth, yeah. But the voters need to know that actually it's not. And unfortunately, the recent reaction has been to go to the other extreme and say we don't need experts, yeah. No, that's ridiculous. I mean, then you become Maoist China, yeah. We need experts, but the experts need to work in a framework with the democratic control and oversight, yeah? So that they're always presented as some group of people who know certain things, but these certain things they know about is only a small part of the big picture, and we need that oversight over whether what they are doing fits with the big picture. And in order to persuade the general public to support something like that, I think they need to know a bit more about the economics, because they are presented this essentially a lie, saying that it's like the science, there's only one right answer, there's no alternative, yeah. And that I think has been the most corrosive thing on our democracy. And yeah, finally, the Jamie's point about the need to have an overarching framework, I agree. I mean, otherwise it becomes total chaos. I mean, there has to be some kind of relatively abstract understanding on how the world is structured, the relationship between the nature and the human society, structure in the human society, human agency. Yeah, so you need some kind of consensus at that level, because otherwise, yeah, you don't even have a basis for the interaction. Yeah, I mean, it will be like insisting that no one learns a foreign language, but everyone can speak in their language. Yeah, and then you don't even know what the other people are saying. So yes, I agree that there has to be that framework, and yeah, hopefully at least some admitted to that framework. I mean, I think some neoclassical economists that wouldn't even want to be there, even if they are invited. But there are people who are more
Let me
open-minded.
try to
So,
move. There's a rather lengthy question which I won't try to read, but that generally focuses on a perspective that's probably shared by a number of people in the audience that argues for a reconceptualization of the development problem in some terms other than the search for economic growth, which is, after all, often reduced to a search for ways to increase a measure of total economic output that was developed in the 1930s and 1940s in the United States and other countries for entirely different purposes, namely the management of the macroeconomy and the depression and the war. And I'm wondering, if you have some thoughts on that question, which is to say, what should be,
yeah.
broadly speaking, the objectives
Mhm.
of economic development?
Yeah.
And there was a second question that dealt with specifically with the problem of migration, which is a problem of international inequality and the uses and abuses of borders. And I wonder if you had asked, really, you have thoughts on how to approach that problem, and what your sense is of the policy alternatives that should be pursued in a world where these inequalities are not about to go away and the incentives to migrate are not about to disappear.
Yeah.
So I think that would be, those two would get us into this space that's been raised by the audience, and I'm looking through the list here, but if
Yeah.
it could address yourself to that, I think
Yeah,
that'd
sure.
be helpful, and I'd encourage the audience to place further questions in the Q&A rather than in the chat, where I can find it more easily.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Reconceptualization of growth. Yes. The development. Yeah. Of course. For several decades, the people have argued that growth is not the same as development, although very often it is reduced to development is reduced to economic growth. But my view is that basically it's about development of should be development of the human capabilities in the context of the coexisting or rather existing as a part of a bigger natural system, the ecological dimension. I mean, we already have the emphasis on capabilities through the works of Amartya Sen and so on, but I think despite the fact that these could have been done, should have been done, the capability school has put not enough emphasis on the development of productive capabilities, which is not the same as ability to grow. And they have put less emphasis on collective capabilities than individual capabilities. So those are things that need to be developed. But yeah, I mean, that basically we need to find a way to make our existence compatible with the natural world. But I think in practical terms, I think that this shouldn't lead to basically what some people have called green ladder kicking, named after my idea of kicking away the ladder, the rich countries using protectionism, subsidies, and so on to become rich and then telling other countries not to do it. Because some people have argued that, sorry guys, we didn't realize before, but now we have realized that we have basically run out of planet. You cannot develop. So we have to fight that because various estimates show that what the poorest countries, let's say countries that depends on the study, but below $4,000-$5,000 per capita income, what they do in terms of economic growth, whatever bad the quality is in terms of the carbon emission, it's not going to make a material difference to what is going on. And it's at that level also sheer economic growth is important. At that level of development, economic growth, however you generate it, becomes a matter of life and death. Because when you grow a bit more, people eat one more bowl of rice, they can visit the pharmacy once more, they can heat the house a bit more people survive. So I think that in translating these things, the big principles into practices, I think we need to consider these the kind of the aspects of reality. Immigration, yes, I mean, the biggest solution will be to reduce global inequality. I mean, most people, I mean, I'm an immigrant myself, but most people want to live where they are from, but if they can help it. There is the climate crisis, wars, and poverty and inequality that is driving all these people to choose to migrate. I mean, people are literally risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean to get to a place where they have higher life chances, despite the fact that there's a significant danger of being killed along the way. People are that desperate. So that's the most important thing you can do. But also that, I think that we have to accept that increasing, intellectual diversity and so on through immigration can be, a good thing for the receiving country, not simply because they might make more money and so on, but the richer our understanding of the world is, the richer our lives are. Yeah, and in that sense, I think that Netflix and all these streaming services have done great service because now you can watch Brazilian drama, Korean drama, Norwegian drama, and you get to have a more nuanced view of the human beings and the different societies. So, we should also emphasize this the social cultural dimensions when we advocate more open immigration policies and not just try to simply give economic numbers.
Let me coax you onto another track, which is one that you've dealt with extensively in other work, in earlier work, which is there was a time when the practice of industrial development under trade protection with strong incentives for immigration and population growth and a heavy emphasis on taking whatever you could from the dominant industrial power, which in those days was England. This was called the American system. And it was a system which Henry Carey famously said was a system that was producing prosperity and equality and the rise of a new continental power. It's now taken on a somewhat less reputable view because what we appear to be seeing in another country, namely China. And I'm wondering whether you would agree that what the Chinese have done is essentially to reproduce the American experience of the 19th century, but to do so in the 20th and the 21st on a much larger scale.
Sure. Yeah. No, I completely agree with that characterization. Basically, the country after country have imitated that system. Yeah, the U.S. Started it. Yeah, the U.S. theorized it in the form of infant industry argument, invented by none other than its first finance minister, namely Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary. And then when it developed these ideas, Germans came and picked up those ideas. Friedrich List, who is sometimes mistakenly known as the father of infant industry argument, learned of this the argument when he was on political exile in the United States in the 1820s, and he learned from the people like Matthew Carey, Henry Carey's father. And then this idea got passed on to through Germany to East Asia. Japan was a big disciple of Germany in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then Korea got it from. So actually, the Americans are responsible for the popularity of this idea. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, I don't think Trump's the geriatric version of the infant industry protection is going to work. It's like trying to give a second chance to a 45-year-old son who has run the family business into the ground. The reason why I say it's not going to work is twofold. One is infant industry argument assumes that when you send the kid to school rather than to the labor market, the kid has to study. Yeah? So going to school, namely protection, is only the precondition. Yeah? The result will be determined by how hard this kid studies. Yeah? Trump has no plan to make the kid, or rather this 45-year-old son, the shape up, because the American corporate sector has lost the ability and willingness to invest. Yeah? In the last, according to works of Bill Lazonic and other people, in the last 30 years, the American stock market has become a ATM. Yeah, more money has come out than that went in. Yeah, American corporations have been giving away 95% of their profits to the shareholders in the form of dividends and stock buybacks. They don't have any money to invest with. So unless Trump says all the industries that I'm going to protect, they need to stop doing stock buybacks and invest that money into raising productivity, because you cannot rely on this protection forever. It will have to be lifted at one day, and you need to, in the meantime, shape up. Unless he has that plan, it's not going to work, guys. Just giving free money to these corporations who will then give it away to the shareholders. Yeah? So that's one reason. And the other is that he instinctively knows that the American corporations are not going to invest. So he's twisting the arms of the Japanese, Koreans, Germans to come and invest in the US. But let me tell you that the US is too large for this the solution to work. I mean, even if it works, yeah, because the Japanese, the Koreans
Let,
are
let,
already.
let me bring a question in, which comes from Bina Pratan in Kathmandu, who asks, what would development policy look like if pluralist economic approaches fully recognize the economic value of unpaid care work in the household sector? So, well, put that on the table. But before that, you've got to think about that one. Ask the question, which is in line with what you're just saying. If you were a rising power, or perhaps already risen, but in the best strength of your engineering and technological ability, and use of increasing returns, and all of the capacities that are now evident in mainly in China, but in other countries as well, would you want to take over in a multipolar world the dominant financial position? Not a formula for undermining every achievement and basically creating an incentive to precisely not study, to precisely not learn, to precisely not be able to reproduce the achievements.
Exactly, yeah.
Essentially what we did in the United States, in my view, in the 1980s, late 70s and 1980s, was move in that direction and destroyed the material basis that leaving us with a burden of wealth and financial power, from which, if I were the Chinese, I wouldn't want to take them over. But what are your view on?
Yeah,
so those
I
two
wouldn't,
things I'll put on the table for you.
Yeah, I don't think China's yet ready to take on the role of the hegemon. Yeah, that you have to realize how dominant the United States was when it became the hegemon and unprecedentedly launched this multilateral system. In 1950, the U.S. was producing 60% of world manufacturing output. Yeah? In the 1870s, at the height of British Empire, the country that invented Industrial Revolution, Britain was only producing 30% of global manufacturing output. Today, you think that China produces everything. It still only produces 30% of the GDP, the manufacturing, global manufacturing GDP. Huh? Unless you are in the position that the US was back in 1950, you cannot take on this. Yeah? I mean, of course, in the end, that kind of became the poison that produced what it is the countries today. But so I don't think China actually wants to take on that role. I mean, at least for another couple of decades. Yeah? And it cannot sustain it even if it did. So yeah, I think for the next generation, we'll live in a multipolar world with different groups allying with the different other groups, and somehow trying to maintain some vestige of multilateralism. I don't see the Chinese takeover. Yeah, the next question, role of care work. Yes, I mean, I'm in my book, Edible Economics, I wrote a chapter discussing that. That was thanks to my wife's the instruction that I should do something about this. Don't just give lip service to being the pro-feminist. I wouldn't dare to call myself a feminist, but the, you have to put the money where your mouth is. So I wrote this short chapter. Yeah, basically the importance of care work needs to be thought of as I mean, it needs to be incorporated into our economic thinking in the most fundamental way. You know, Irene said it cannot be add women and stir. No, I mean, unless we begin to, I mean, not that I have developed such a theory, but unless we begin to conceptualize a world where, you know, we understand human welfare in a completely different way, not just money, but you know, the community, family, you know, personal ties, and all these things that economics things that will be useless in front of this powerful thing called money or material incentive. I mean, these need to be incorporated because we have this world in which at least 1 billion people live in the countries which doesn't lack fundamentally anything in the material existence. Yeah. Now the more important thing is how we live. Yeah. And even for poorer countries, I mean, yeah, they might have to focus more on material betterment, but even they need to think about this so that they don't repeat the mistakes that have been made by the richer countries. Yeah. So nature and but the care economy, these things need to be brought into the center of economics.
We have one last question in
Yeah.
the Q&A section, and then I'd like to ask Professor Van Staveren and Dr. Conceicao if they have final thoughts that they want to offer here. But the question is quite interesting from a methodological point of view, where you presented us with a list of pluralistic approaches as alternatives to the mainstream one. Mainstream one is very clear on its policy implications. They're all very straightforward, and they all, in my humble and well-considered opinion, lead toward disaster. But then the question is, presenting an alternative as an advisor to policymakers, what filters do you apply to the pluralistic, to the perspective that you think should be appropriate? I mean, what's your touchstone in sense of separating the sensible from the not so sensible, the wise from the wild as a policy advisor?
Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, I'm not sure whether you can say that the mainstream has a clear policy implications, because here we have a difficulty in the internal diversity of neoclassical economics. Yeah, so both Milton Friedman and Joe Stiglitz have used the neoclassical concepts to come up with very different the policy recommendations. Yeah. So I think neoclassical economics itself can be diverse, but you are right. I mean, mainstream economics, which is sort of the more the pro-market version of neoclassical economics, it has a clear list of recommendations. Yeah. Now, having said that, how would the pluralists approach this? I mean, I think that's where the question of the values and the political the conversation become very important, because depending on what you want, you may have to apply different theories even in the same area. Yeah? Depending on which area you want to put emphasis on, is it the social development or is it environmental protection, you might have to give priority to different theories. Yeah. So I think that being a pluralist that actually forces you to become politically and ethically more aware about all these difficult questions that we have to confront. But once you have that kind of framework, then there'll be clear implications because all these different schools have their own logic, they have their analytical tools, and you can draw pretty clear conclusions.
Okay. Professor von Staveren, would you like to offer a few final words here?
Well, let me indeed talk a little bit about this issue of care that you raised from the chat and care work. And I'm very happy that Ha-Joon included in his last book, the book that I don't have yet, so I should get soon, Edible Economics, a chapter on care and care work, and argues that it should be integrated. And of course, in feminist economics, we lots of us already thought about how it should be integrated. And I think that is also a responsibility that every economist, also outside feminist economics, could learn from, take on, just to mention two ways in which it could be integrated. First, in a, say, rather negative perspective, to see lots of care work being largely done by women as a constraint. The productivity is low because nobody invests in it, the government hardly supports it, and so on. So it's a constraint on women's time, which could be used in other ways more productively. So a distributional issue, redistribution between men and women, and support by governments. But there's also a more positive perspective on how to integrate care by looking at its value. In feminist philosophy, about 30 years ago, the theory of care has been developed as an alternative to both utilitarianism, which is, of course, the foundation of neoclassical economics, and Kantian, more rule-based ethics. So it's a contextual ethics, the ethics of care, it's relational. And once you put on those glasses, it helps you to explain many things that any other economic theory can't explain. For example, intrinsic motivation of workers. Or the precautionary principle in ecological economics, from an ethical perspective. I once, in an article in the Cambridge Journal of Economics on feminist economics and post-Keynesian economics, suggested a flip side to Keynes' animal spirits and labeled it caring spirits. Mm-hmm. That is what drives lots of caring work. So, we can also use it in a positive way to enrich economic theories.
Okay.
Excellent.
Pedro Conceicao, last word here. Go ahead.
Just a quick reflection on care, and then a final thought on how to choose if you're a pluralist. So on care, I think there's a difference between what's happening in high-income economies compared to lower-income economies. In high-income economies, if you take the US, for instance, if you look at the last GDP numbers, and if you take the AI boom out, the sectors of the economy that are growing relate actually to care and healthcare in particular. So I think that particularly as we see population aging, and this is something that we didn't discuss, but it would perhaps merit a conversation, as we see fertility rates declining below replacement rate in many, many countries. I think how to deal with care is going to be a fundamental economic, social, and political issue. So I think that as I said, in high-income economies, the market may be already reacting and valuing, even if it undervalues clearly these activities. In lower-income countries, it's not accounted for at all. So I think there are different problems in different economies, in my view. Now, how to choose amongst if you're a pluralist economist, if you adopt that view? One possible response is to go the direction I suggested, which is to have usefulness as a criterion. So identify the problem that you're trying to solve, identify from the toolkit of economics what would be most appropriate to help you to solve that problem, and be explicit about it, right? Be explicit about the mechanisms and the assumptions. I think that is something that is crucial, and we often fail to do. And lay it out to a decision maker, to a policy maker, why you're giving a certain recommendation, which might be wrong or might be rejected on the basis of other considerations, might be rejected on the basis of political considerations. But I think being explicit is something very important, and usefulness as a criteria. And the other thing that in our work in Human Development Report is to have a purpose. So what are you trying to achieve? And you can have different goals. You can be trying to achieve sustainability or welfare using a standard welfare framework. So from our perspective, as Ha-Joon mentioned, it's about capabilities, human capabilities. So that's the goal. So being explicit about the goal, not to try to be hegemonic and saying this is the only way of looking at the world and this is the only goal that's worthwhile pursuing, but being explicit about what you're trying to achieve also is very important. Thank you.
Very good. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're a little bit over time, so I think we'll leave it there. I want to thank, first of all, our two discussants, Irene von Staveren and Pedro Conceicao, for very thoughtful comments. I want to especially thank Ha-Joon Chang for leading this discussion and giving us insight into the vast range of his ideas and his perspective and critique on the practice, theory and practice of economics. And I'd like to say a word of thanks to Rick Sammons, who really is the organizer of these series, and to Juanita, who has kept it going behind the scenes and kept everything rolling along. I really greatly appreciate the opportunity to moderate this session, and I'm looking forward to interacting further with the members of the UN Economist Network and in webinars that we will be organizing in the near future. So with that, let me wish you a pleasant evening or late night or early morning, wherever you may be. In my case, I think it's probably time for the second cup of coffee and possibly even breakfast. So I will leave you. I will leave you on that note. Once again, thanks to everybody for a really inspiring and successful discussion.
Thank you, James.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah.
Thanks all of you. Thanks so much. Wonderful.